Lionel, is that you?
There, I think I got it. Dave?
Lionel.
Dave.
Good evening, sir.
Have you seen Tony around? Tony's supposed to be in the studio. Tony Koester, the editor of Model Railroad News.
The editor of Model Railroad News? Yeah, I actually passed him on the way in.
Oh, did you?
I did.
Was he asleep in the lobby again?
Not when I walked through. I don't do anything. I don't do anything quietly.
Okay. A lot of times after Wheel of Fortune, he dozes off down there, and we got to wake him up and get somebody to drive him home. Yeah.
We're going to do things a little different tonight. This is part 3 of our 47-part trilogy with Tony Koester, TK. We're going to refer to him as TK tonight because we also have Tony Koester here, the editor of Model Railroad News, and hopefully by the end of the night we can have some sort of cage match between two editors. All right, let's get ready to rumble.
Oh my God.
Yeah, well, Tony, come on in, TK.
Good evening.
Perfect. So tonight we're going to talk to TK. If you don't mind, can you help co-host for a little bit first before we get to your third part of your 47-part trilogy? Because we got a really cool story to tell. Tony Koester, can you help co-host for a bit?
I'd be happy to.
All right, we're going to make Dave the guest for the first part. Because today, Dave Abelies, or Uncle Dave as we like to call him, did something really, really cool working at New Jersey Transit. I believe he's are you the president, Dave?
No.
Okay.
No, far from it. I'm the general superintendent of rail stations.
General superintendent of rail stations. As opposed to the general superintendent of bus stations?
Of transportation or of infrastructure engineering or of, actually not infrastructure engineering, excuse me, of transportation or of New York Penn Station. There's 4 general superintendents on the railroad.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay, run that by me again. So you're the general superintendent in charge of rail stations.
Yep. There's a general superintendent that's in charge of New York Penn Station operations.
Right.
Then there's a general superintendent of transportation for the Hoboken division. And finally, a general superintendent of stations for the Newark division.
Or Newark.
Yep.
Hey, TK.
Yes.
How do you pronounce Newark?
1 syllable.
See, that doesn't even sound like Newark.
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 Is that
Newark?
Is that
Newark?
Yeah. Yep. So TK, you pronounce it the same way.
Yeah, it's not like Newark, California or something, but it's just Newark.
Newark. All right, if you guys say so. What about you, Tony? How would you pronounce it?
New Jersey. I wouldn't even try for. I thought it was Newark. I would have said Newark, like Newark.
I know,
but,
and
I know I've learned something here.
And Dave is always going Newark. It's like there was a comedy show. Now this is right up your alley, Tony. There was a Newark. What was that thing? There was a TV show where the guy went around Snork.
Oh, I don't remember that.
Yeah, you'll remember it once.
Was it a cartoon?
Nah. Okay. There was some comedy, some half-hour situation comedy where the guy was doing something anyways. All right. So anyways, TK, we need you to be the co-host for a bit because we're going to steal a bit of your time and we're going to talk to Uncle Dave Abelies about what he did today as the general superintendent of rail stations for New Jersey Transit. So it was a typical day, Dave, right?
Not really.
Did it start out typical? Like you got up out of bed? What do you have for breakfast?
I had black coffee for breakfast.
No,
that's it.
That's it.
That's it.
When do you have food?
Around lunchtime, and then again at supper time.
All right. You should at least have a banana or something.
If I was hungry, I would, but I'm not usually hungry when I wake up at 5 or 6 in the morning. I'm My body gets hungry around 11 or 12, and so that's when I eat.
All right. Big donut or something?
Back in the day, yeah. But yeah, so it was a typical, wake up and go day. But we had gotten a phone call. I'd gotten a phone call from the president of the railroad on Friday afternoon at 3 p.m. And, as a railroader, anytime you're getting a call on a commuter railroad or passenger railroad at 3 p.m. on a Friday from the boss, it's very rarely good news. But in this particular case, it was a lot of work, but it ended up being very good news the way it came together. So we'll take the rare good stuff when it happens. But we were told that we needed to prepare Somerville and Westfield stations, both on the Raritan Valley Line, the former Central Road in New Jersey, both stations that I maintain through my workforce. And we had to prepare them to host the United States Federal Secretary of Transportation, which is Pete Buttigieg, who was a former presidential candidate, Democratic presidential candidate, and he's now the Secretary of Transportation, former mayor of South Bend, Indiana. So it's actually a town I've been to, watching trains on Conrail back in the 90s. And sure enough, right on time this morning, a couple of black SUVs pull up, and I was able to ask the team if Mr. Secretary wanted an office instead of the car to wait for his assigned time to speak, and he did. So he got out of the car, and I shook his hand, and I walked his whole entourage up to the office at Somerville.
So why were they there? Just to see if you were having something for breakfast or what?
They asked about black coffee. But no, they ended up being there in support of the current U.S. transportation bill. There's in Congress right now. There's an infrastructure bill to improve transportation, railroads, highways, airports, et cetera, around the country. And today was a field trip to speak in support of that bill to a group of mayors and senators, as well as assemblymen from Congress who accompanied the secretary. And they all, discussed various plans along the Raritan Valley Line for, expansions of capacity and how they can improve interlockings to improve through train on-time performance and some capital projects to improve the whole system. So it's not every day you get to shake the hand of somebody that's in the president's cabinet, but I got to do it today. And it was pretty fun. It was a really exciting day.
So what did Pete seem like in person? Like, was he friendly? Did he kind of blow you off or?
Friendly, engaging, curious. He asked one of my employees, Heath Hoffmeister, who's actually a buddy that met my brother in college way back. And so ironically, he's at Transit now and ended up working for the infrastructure group. So he and I worked closely together, and he was there with me at the station along with several custodians and some transportation people. And he, I call him Mayor Pete because that's how he was introduced during the campaign. Sure enough, he says, "So what are all these clips?" And that's a railroad spike, right? And he says, "Yeah." Well, he says, "What's this little curly Q clip?" And he says, "Well, that's a Pandrel clip." Well, what's that for, Mr. The secretary says, and Heath goes on and says, "Well, it's for on curves and high speed track and tight clearance areas where you really have to lock that gauge in. This is a special kind of clip that goes into the track on a special plate, and it holds the rail not just up and down, but also back and forth, also laterally." And, the secretary nodded along, very curious. And by all reports, he's a sharp guy, speaks 7 languages, and very interested and excitable kind of guy. And sure enough, I saw nothing that swayed me from that. He really seemed like someone that was interested in what he was doing and happy to be there. Very, very engaging with everybody he talked to. Everything from the local mayor and the local town Congress or local town council people in Somerville, which is a small town in New Jersey, really, and right up to the commissioner of transportation from the state of New Jersey. So it was neat. It was a real interesting cross section, and a real honor to host somebody of that level in our little former ticket office that I converted to a office for our department about 8 years ago. And sure enough, there's the Secretary of Transportation sitting in my office chair. It's one of those. I'm going to look. I have to write the story down for myself, or it's going to seem surreal very quickly.
You have photos? Did you take photos?
Nobody else from my team was taking photos. Even the media group with Transit was only taking the professional photographs. So I didn't want to take out my phone and start snapping pictures. But I did request that the professional get a few pictures, some candid shots with the two of us together. So I'm hopeful that he'll come out with one or two, and if that happens, I'll pass them along.
TK, I'm about to ask him the $1 million question. Can you guess what that is?
No.
So, at any point, did you mention Modeler's Life, the AML Nation, the podcast?
No, I kept this strictly NJ Transit oriented.
Oh, okay.
I didn't mention the Onondaga cutoff. I didn't mention my family. We talked about NJ Transit.
So, coming from the other end of it, is there any chance he went, are you that Dave Aviles that I hear on?
Not that I know of, but he's a smooth character. He's a cool cat, and one never knows. He's a curious guy, and coming into it as a mayor of a city in the Midwest, I would argue there's probably a lot of resources to draw from to learn more about transportation, and one never knows. Maybe he'll come across one of the ones that we're familiar with,
all right,
like a Modeler's Life.
Let me just ask one or two more questions, and then we'll get busy because we're going to talk. Tony, I hope this is going to be difficult for me. TK, I hope you're ready with all your Jim Boyd stories because I'm very excited about this.
Oh, yeah.
And Tony, I'm hoping tonight you can be on your best behavior. Okay.
I will endeavor to do so. I'm very eager to hear about Jim Boyd because I never had the opportunity to meet him, but have been scanning his slides from Kevin U. Daly's collection for years, and he's so well known. So there's probably not a couple days that go by that I don't end up with a Jim Boyd slide in my hands while I'm scanning and working on things. So I'm very excited to hear some
Dave,
firsthand.
You are the general superintendent of rail stations, and who do you answer to? Is it your level? Then there's a vice president and a president, or?
Essentially, yeah. And on the railroad, on my railroad, they call that a senior vice president, which is the president of the railroad. Senior vice, basically a general manager of the railroad and a senior vice president of the corporation. Because there's the railroad, the bus operation, the light rail operation, then there's the police department and corporate, et cetera. So under the NJ Transit corporate umbrella, NJ Transit Rail Operations is one of the three operating groups. So within that railroad, my boss answers to the general manager. And so they call her a deputy general manager, which is basically a vice president of the railroad.
Well, now I'm completely confused. That's cool, though. That is very, very cool. That whole thing, the fact that Pete Buttigieg showed up, and actually I got a text about it, which was even cooler. I was like just walking along there with my dog Lucy, and all of a sudden I get a text like, "You're never going to guess what happened to me today," which was very cool. And I just held out hope that there was any slight possibility that he may have mentioned the podcast. I understand that you didn't mention it, Dave, because you want to seem very proper, and it's your job, and you don't want to seem like you're distracted by other podcasts. But I'm thinking, man, transportation podcast is about transportation. And I thought just maybe.
Hey, one never knows.
To listen to something
one never
while
knows.
He's flying along.
And I was talking to his security detail. Each of the cabinet members, it turns out they have their own special security detail that travels with them because they generally travel for months at a time. And this Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, has been traveling uninterrupted for 3 months. Has not been home for 3 months. And the whole security detail travels with him. And it's just event after event after event. So it's nice to see a politician, out there, really beating the pavement and trying to carry this message out about this infrastructure bill. The old grassroots approach. I mean, that's how you get stuff done in this country, unless you're very, very, very wealthy. And even then, the system can still surprise you, and you do get some real out of the woods candidates to some degree. And it's nice to see that the Secretary of Transportation is taking that message to heart, and he's out there pushing the agenda because it's important stuff. This is stuff that actually matters.
The New Jersey Transit Raritan Valley line is the most relevant train line to the NJRoute22.com. with 18 stations located in the NJ. What's NJ Route 22? Never mind. Well, that's another day for another. I'm stopping. Yeah,
that's a deep rabbit hole, sir.
Let's get back. Okay, TK, your co-hosting duties are over. You are now the primary guest of the evening.
All right. Well, where are we going to go? Are we going to talk about Jim Boyd, or are we going to let Tony cook?
How did you first meet Jim Boyd?
Well, Jim and I are both Midwesterners, and I think I met him through a Midwest region convention. And, of course, Jim had made a name for himself by writing these diesel roster articles for Railroad Model Craftsman. And I think I bumped into him at a Midwest regional up near Chicago. And we became good friends. And I found out that Jim had worked for a TV station. He'd studied the graphic arts in college. I don't think he had a degree in that, but he'd worked for a TV station. And he'd done a little on-the-air camera work when there was a tornado or something, and he was doing the videography work, and he actually had to get on the camera and describe what was happening, and he was a natural. If you followed his career at all, you'd notice that he had done a lot of railfan videos in his later life, and he's just a natural on camera. And he then got a job at General Motors EMD as a field tech, and he toured the country with EMD delivering new locomotives. And sometimes these would be Rio Grande Jeep 40s, sometimes they'd be a Jeep 40 for some short line that had no business getting a GP 40 because the thing would never get out of the first transition. But the owner of the short line would tell him that he wanted the best thing GM made, and that was a GP 40, and by God, he was going to have one. That's a quote. And then Jim got laid off, and he went to IC as a brakeman. And that was a little scary job because some of those guys were pretty heavy drinkers. And I remember Jim talking about standing right behind the engineer, watching everything that was going on to make sure the guy didn't fall asleep and get him into deep trouble. But he became a good family friend, and in 1966, I founded with Glenn Pizer the Nickel Plate Historical and Technical Society, and that's where I got my publishing experience. I had to learn how to produce a magazine, because really we weren't selling memberships as much as we were like National Geographic. We were really selling subscriptions, still are to this day, and that led to one rather humorous moment when I was looking all over the place for the nickel plate bi-level auto racks before they disappeared under N&W paint, and I had Judy keeping an eye peeled for the ETTX with a certain number auto racks as we drove. We lived in Lafayette because I worked at a small civil engineering company after I left Purdue. In Lafayette, and as we drove by the big Monon yard there in Lafayette, I had her keep a wary eye out for these auto racks, and I had Jim looking for them too. And one day he called the house and I wasn't there, and he said, "Well, tell Tony I found one of those nickel plate RTTX tri-levels or bi-levels." And Judy said, "You mean those ETTX auto racks?" And Jim was just dead quiet. Later, he called me back and he says, "If you ever do anything to offend that girl, I'm going to personally take you out behind the woodshed and beat the hell out of you." You got a winner. Yeah. So we became very good friends. And then in 1968, when I went out to the East Coast to chase, I'd been involved in the 759 resurrection in a very minor way. I was talking to John Rehor about the guy who wrote the nickel plate story, the Book of John, as we call it. John had called me to ask about whether Dale Moses, who had been the Frankfurt Roundhouse foreman, whether he was up to helping them get the 759 running again. And so I was involved in that end of it. And so when it first got going out of Conneaut, I was with Jim, and we rode the first trip to from Conneaut, Ohio to Buffalo and back, and because I knew John Rior, John was riding in the Claytor Lake, the business car, with Bruce Sturzing, who was then an NW attorney. He went on to become the president of the Delaware and Hudson, and he's still a good friend to this day, in fact. And so we were riding back and forth. We didn't ride eastbound on the Claytor Lake, but John invited us back up to ride in the Claytor Lake on the westbound run, and so we're sitting on the open platform, or standing out on the open platform with John Rior, who had no sense of humor whatsoever. He was a pretty tightly wrapped guy, and so as we were going along, it's starting to get a little bit dark, and you could kind of see the Mars light of the Berkshire swinging from side to side as you looked ahead. And we caught up with a Penn Central caboose where the Nickel Plate and the New York Central parallel each other. And as we started to catch up with this train, the slack kind of ran out on our train, and you could tell our engineer was leaning into it pretty hard. And we were clocking the milepost, and we were doing 70 miles an hour. And that Penn Central drag wasn't doing anywhere near that. And we looked up ahead, and there was a couple of 2 or 3 Alco Centuries that were smoking pretty badly, and you could see a white shirt in the fireman's side seat because he was to our right. And then there were 2 or 3 white shirts looking out that side window, as this Nickel Plate Burke was catching up to him and making a hell of a racket as it came roaring up in the Mars Light wagon and all that stuff. And we went by them like they were standing still. And John Rior, without even cracking a smile, he said to Jim and me, he says, "I know exactly what those Penn Central guys are saying." And we just looked at him, and he said, "They're saying, oh, crap, the Nickel Plate's back in steam."
So, Tony Cook, you are now scanning Jim Boyd's. Like, I have heard endless times that Jim Boyd's photography. I've actually heard people say it's second to none almost as rail fan photography. Like, how have you ended up scanning all these Jim Boyd slides?
Kevin U. Daly acquired his collection after Jim had passed away, and we have not all of it, 'cause some of the collection, he traded and other things over the years, but there's a substantial amount in Kevin's collection of various railroads that is Jim Boyd slides. And that's one of the things I do to kind of feed the magazines I work on, and is kind of a side thing because it's fun to just go through slides. I always have a box open that I'm working through something. Like, for example, right now I'm doing Milwaukee Road stuff, and there's a lot of Jim Boyd in there of his work. But you can always tell his slides because as I'm scanning them, I'm not always looking closely as I put them into the scanner as to who and what. But Boyd had a great eye, I think, for lining up and setting up a shot. And he a typical like Jim Boyd daytime shot to me is one of those where maybe there's a post office that's in the foreground, and then the railroad crossing behind it, and there'll be like Erie Lackawanna Centuries or something, coming into the intersection, that he really set some great looking pictures. And then, of course, a lot of his night shots, I really got enthralled with those in scanning slides, that he did a lot of night photography where he'd set up lights and those things to catch, different, usually stuff sitting someplace, between assignments. But I think those are really fascinating and neat shots too. When you think of the work that went into, sometimes it's obvious that maybe it's just car headlights that he lined a car up just right so he could get a picture. But other times, that it wasn't just you walk up there and snap the picture, that, this took a little work to light all this in the evening to get that green band Western, RS-27 or something.
Yeah, I think he really had an eye for composition. And
yes.
He did it in a way to my eye. I mean, I've always loved telephoto photography, and that's my favorite action photos are telephoto because of the drama it conveys, the layers that come out. But Jim, and this is something Tony Koester, actually, you taught me this very early in my model photos, in some good honest critique, was that look, don't submit a photo that doesn't tell a story. And Jim Boyd's photographs, and mostly without the use of a telephoto lens. Certainly some telephoto work, but by and large, his eye for composition in these small towns or these open fields, he could really tell a story with just a very straightforward angle. The lighting was good, but the composition was always excellent. And it was in a day when you couldn't Photoshop things out. So he worked for this stuff. And I've always looked up to that. I think he really had a great eye for composition.
And when you say telling a story, that's it. That's what I was trying to get to. You can look at those slides, and whether it's like kids on a bicycle waving at, caboose going by, it immediately brings what's going on, or you get it's a nice summer afternoon and these kids are out for a bike ride and a Conrail train came by and here they are waving or whatever. That again, that story. And that's when you think about that, a picture's worth 1,000 words. He got at least 1,000 out of most of his pictures.
Many of Jim's trips I made with him, and one story that kind of puts it all in perspective. I always said that if I looked around and decided exactly where the right photo was and jumped into a bush and the bush said, oof, and Jim, that's because Jim was already in the same bush. and that actually happened. There was a train show, one of the NMRA national train shows, and I was working for Railroad Model Craftsman, and all the Kalmbach people are good friends and always have been. And there was a new guy at the Kalmbach booth, and I went sauntering up to the booth, and the new kid on the block there held up, he just said, you stopped by to see some really quality publications? And the other guys at the booth, knowing that he should have known better than to bait me, kind of reeled back and got smiles on their face, knowing what was going to happen from that point on. And I looked at him and I says, well, yeah, and in fact, I did come by just exactly for that reason. For example, why don't you pick up the book by David P. Morgan on the Southern Mikado 4501? And so he went back to their book rack and picked up that book. And I said, now let's look at the dust jacket photo. There's two big photos and one small photo. The small photo is just of the bell, and that's by each reed. But look at the two photos showing the engine coming and going. Those are magnificent photos. And I said, it's Kalmbach quality showing through with the choice of photography there. I am so impressed. And he said, well, thank you for the compliment. I said, by the way, who took those photos? And so he opened up, and it was Jim Boyd and me. and the reason David Morgan didn't know at the time, but they were shot from the same bush. Jim was standing on one side of this bush shooting the coming shot, and I was standing on the other side of the bush shooting the going away shot. And we were both shooting Ektachrome X because we couldn't stand Kodachrome X. It was too grainy, dark or something. Harsh is a good word. Contrasty, I guess, is the right word. But at any rate, I always judge my photography by whether or not it was something that Jim might have shot. And fortunately, I made many, many, many trips with Jim. We'd almost every spring and April, we'd head for West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky and that area together. But we made many trips to New England and everywhere. So if I ever took a good picture, it's probably because of Jim's tutelage. He's a remarkable guy.
So you met him in the mid '60s, and you said he was delivering he was delivering locomotives for EMD.
Yeah, he was the field tech. In other words, when you got a new locomotive, a set of new locomotives, or even just one locomotive, they send a field tech with it. And something went wrong, a ground relay tripped or something like that. The field tech would be right there to take care of it for you, or to call the engineers back at EMD to say, hey, what's going on? And that was Jim's job. And Bruce Meyer, his famous photographer, Bruce was electrical engineer, vice president at EMD, and Jim was downstream of those guys.
Do you think he took many photos when when he was doing that, delivering these Jeep 40s and stuff, did he do photography then too? Do you think while he was on? Like, was he one of these guys that, like, right out of the box, he just loved to do railroad photography? And I mean, he ended up with this cool job of delivering Jeep 40s. What do you think he did a lot of photography then?
Oh yeah, all those RMC articles were done because Jim was, if he was for example, delivering Jeep 40s to the Cotton Belt. He had permission to be on the property, and so he'd photograph everything, at Texarkana or wherever he happened to be, and that was the nucleus of those RMC articles. So he had been a rabid rail fan before he ever got that job, but that job was what really made life easy for him because he couldn't afford to travel all over the United States on his own dime. In his own Volkswagen, because he always had a series of VWs. But EMD financed all those articles.
They are really awesome pictures. In fact, just in the last week or so, I'm working on an article for Diesel Era on the Jeep 40s that went to Georgia, Atlanta and West Point, and why am I drawing a blank? What's the other of those three of the family roads? Georgia, Atlanta and West Point. Who's the other? They all had black Jeep 40s, and they were in like the 700 number series. But anyway, I saw there was pictures of Jim delivering a brand new black Georgia Jeep 40 in like 67 or 68. And so, yeah, I run into those pictures a lot where it's a brand new locomotive being delivered.
I know. Isn't this great?
I bring up, did Jim take any photos while he was delivering EMDs? And Tony goes, oh, yeah, he did it, EMD financed all those trips. And the next thing you know, you hear Tony Cook talking about, oh, yeah, I'm doing an article for Diesel Era using a whole bunch of Jim Boyd photos.
Look, it's one of the things that's so exciting about 2021 and this hobby is that, you could argue that the one thing that was really missing for newcomers in the hobby was this conduit to understand who was doing what and where. And we just heard it. I mean, we've got, Tony Koester and Jim Boyd, lifelong friends with all the stories that come along with that kind of kinship and that kind of camaraderie, which is, that's what railroading is all about, whether it's model or prototype. It's all about doing stuff together. And then we got Tony Cook, who's, putting together yet another fantastic article in Diesel Era, which is a great magazine. I actually just purchased a couple back issues myself last week for a different project. But this is great. This is fantastic.
And TK, I see those Volkswagens all the time, and I've had Mike Schaefer. Mike Schaefer was a young kid. I assume you knew Mike back then too, wasn't he? About college age, about 1970.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's pictures of that poor VW from Chicago to all the way out to the Pacific Northwest, and I think, my gosh, what a tough way to do that. And I think Mike Schaefer told me about, maybe it was the Golden Spike thing of 1969 that they were going out for that in July of 69. They had the VW, and something like, he said at one point, Boyd dropped off Mike and somebody else to railfan all day while he took the Volkswagen to some garage and had its like transmission or something rebuilt because it had broken down and he missed. But then, as Schaefer would say, he goes, but then we lucked out because we caught like a late running Portland Rose or this or that later that day that we wouldn't have seen otherwise. And it's just like, wow, that's serious rail fanning in a VW Bug in the late 60s. Wow.
They were also headed to the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, and they went to Avery, Idaho. And if you know anything about the Milwaukee Road, you know about the last place on the planet that you really want to go to is Avery, Idaho. It is in the boony of the boondocks. And the other guy that was with him is Richard Dean from Atlanta. And so Mike was in the front seat, I think, with Jim driving. If you were with Boyd drove, period. He didn't trust anybody, like him riding behind the engineer on the IC. And so when Jim got on an airliner, everybody else turned left to go get a seat or turn right to get a seat. Jim had turned left and try to bargain his way into the cockpit. So don't mind me, boys. I'll just kind of keep an eye on things here. He didn't trust anybody. And So he drove, and so he had his Beetle, and here they are on this godforsaken road on the way to Avery, and somehow before they got there, or when they got there, they wound up with somebody got a milkshake. It was Richard. He was in the back seat, and so Mike was in the front seat with a Coke bottle, the classic hourglass Coke bottle. So when he got done drinking the Coke bottle, he flipped it into the back seat, and it went like a piston into the milkshake cup, and it just coated the entire inside of the Beetle with malt. Just coated it, which forever ingratiated him with Boyd. He was so Jim decided he was going to get even with those guys, and they're all competitive photographers. So they kept going west. So they went to the northwest, and then they were headed back towards the east. The trip is done on its dying leg. And Jim, they're in Denver somewhere, and Jim says, "By the way, did you guys notice that when we were in Ansonia or whatever, Astoria, Oregon, that I walked out on that little precipice out there?" And Mike and Richard said, "Yeah, we saw you out there." And he says, "Yeah," he said, "I just want you guys to notice that I was a little further north and a little further west than either one of you were on this trip." And it really ticked them off. And Richard was so mad that Boyd put him on an airplane in Denver and sent him back to Atlanta.
So
I don't know whatever happened to Richard. I guess he's still around somewhere. But those guys. I mean, railfan photography was a combat sport. But Mike and Jim were always pretty good friends, and I think Mike would tell you that he learned a lot from Jim, and I'm sure Jim learned a couple things from Mike too. One of the big things that we were all getting into in the 70s was the business of lap dissolved photography with Kodak carousels, where you'd have two carousels running and have a fade business, so that you could put a title slide that faded in and out. I mean, what links we had to go to before the digital age, and there was Mel Patrick and guys in the Midwest were working on that. Schaefer was another one. There was a lot of great things that happened, and it was a rather small group of guys, and Boyd was in the middle of that too, and all these groups that met out in California still do to this day, in Cincinnati and other places. So Jim had an influence more than just taking pictures, but also in the use of the photography.
So where did Jim Boyd live that he drove out to Avery, Idaho in a Volkswagen Beetle?
Well, Jim was born and raised in Dixon, Illinois. His mom and dad were divorced. That's also where Ronald Reagan's from. His mom was a good friend with Dutch Reagan. His mom, Katie Boyd, was a very accomplished pilot. She had ratings in 727s, for example. Wrote the book that people would study to get an instrument rating at these 3-day courses at Holiday Inns and stuff like that. Built a pit special home built with the help of a friend. Quite a woman. So Jim came from an interesting family on his mom's side, and he was from Dixon, and that's where all this emanated from. Mike Schaefer's from that general area. He's from right now Lee, Illinois, I think, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, he was we call him the mayor of Lee. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't know. I think he might have been born around. I think he was probably from Rockford, but I'm not sure.
Man, so he drove all the way from Chicago or that area, Illinois, all the way out to Idaho in a Volkswagen Bug, and those Beetles from the '60s. They weren't necessarily. They didn't have that Cadillac feel. Let's put it that way.
They weren't. I had one. I had a '64 Beetle, I think.
That was my first car. Was my dad went and bought two mid '60s Beetles, and we took the motor out of one and put it in the body of the other because you could do that sort of stuff at home. And then you could reverse the wheels and paint them, and you could be like the coolest kid in the high school with your mid-60s Beetle. So, how did you ever own a Beetle, Dave?
No, but my buddy Heath actually has one to this day.
So how did Jim Boyd end up at Karsten's Publications?
Well, when I had gone out to, like I had mentioned, I'd gone out in October of '68 to chase 759 down the Hudson, and had gone on to an appointment with Hal Karstens to propose Railfan magazine, and he'd pulled a file folder out of his drawer saying Railfan magazine. He'd had the same idea, but he said the timing wasn't right. And I said, well, okay, I got a job. I work for a small engineering firm in Lafayette, so fine, but if you need any help with RMC, let me know, and he did. So I talked to Judy, and we said it sounded like a good idea. So I went to work there in January 1969. Meanwhile, Hal then bought Flying Models magazine, but the editor lived out on Long Island and wasn't interested in moving to New Jersey, so Hal needed help in the office with Flying Models production. So Hal hired Jim in 1971 to produce Flying Models, kind of like a managing editor. I'm sure he was just, rail banking him is what he was doing. And so that went on for 2-3 years. And then in 1974 or so, late 74, early 75, I'm not sure when, our ad manager, Wayne Daniels, who is a rail fan too, called Jim and me into his office and said, hey, look, I've got copy here for an advertising rate card that doesn't make any sense for our other magazines, which were Flying Models and Creative Crafts and Railroad Model Craftsman. This copy doesn't fit any of that. And he says, I think Hal's going to launch a new magazine, and I think it's going to be Railfan. So Jim and I immediately got real busy with the magazine. I designed the graphics of it based on Air Progress magazine, which is what my original proposal to Hal was in the first place. I handed him a dummy of what it might look like based on Air Progress. And Jim, meanwhile, rounded up an editorial package. And then one day Hal called him down to his office and said that he was going to launch the Rail Fan magazine in the fall of '75. And Jim goes, oh, really? And Hal said, oh, cut the crap. He said, I can't get anything by you guys. And Jim says, well, Hal, he says, would you like to see the first issue? Because we had it all done.
Wow.
And the only thing we didn't have done was the cover. And so Hal picked the cover, and I, to this day, think it was a poor cover, but, the boss is the boss. And so that's how Jim came to Karsten's, and that's how Jim came to be the editor of Railfan. He kept the title of managing editor for a long time, and that was my fault in that Hal didn't want to give up the title of editor of Railroad Model Craftsman. It was kind of special to him. So I wound up with the title of managing editor for a long time, even though Hal had nothing to do with the production of the magazine. It was just Hal's ego that he just wanted to be the editor. And he finally relinquished the title.
So did Hal Karstens hire Jim Boyd based on your recommendation or something? Like, how did Hal know of Jim? Like, did you find out that, I can't believe that the guy from Long Island just didn't work from home and use the internet back then in the 60s.
Yeah, right.
Well,
what was he thinking?
Hal had been publishing Jim's articles for a long time, those diesel roster articles, and so Jim knew how to write articles and take photos and do darkroom work and all the stuff we needed to do. So Jim was a known commodity. And so if you wanted an editor for the magazine, that was a pretty obvious candidate.
So how long did Jim stay at Karsten's then, or Railfan? Here's something before we go on, and I hope our buddy Otto Vondrak is listening to this, because I have floated this idea out there at White River several times, and I don't understand why they haven't jumped on the bandwagon. But I know a lot of people have trouble distinguishing, is it railfan and railroad or railroad and railfan, and I came up with the idea that alternate months. January it's railfan and railroad. February it's railroad and railfan. March it's if you got behind that, TK, if you got behind that and said, I'm loving this idea that Lionel's came up with, it might really start to gain some traction.
Yeah, you can count on me being way behind that.
So Karsten's history. I mean, I know of obviously of RMC, Rail. So Tony, TK, you were part of the first issues of Railfan and Railroad. Then, now, did they do a prototype magazine before that?
No.
Okay, so I didn't realize how recent that was. Fair enough. Okay,
and that's I think
then later bought Railroad magazine from Freeman Hubbard and merged the two together. And that became Railfan and Railroad magazine. So
excellent! Wow, awesome!
And that's if you look back before Railfan, what is Railfan TK is 1974, I think it starts. You'll look at older Railroad Model Craftsman, and you'll see those covers of Jim Boyd's of like the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle, or Penn Central or L&N stuff, where it's prototype on the cover of Railroad Model Craftsman, which, if you saw that today, you'd kind of scratch your head of like, why does this model train magazine have a prototype picture on the cover? But Craftsman in those days kind of did that dual service thanks to those Jim Boyd articles and such, that there was a lot of prototype in it, which is kind of one of those things that I adopted that, and the things of like mainline modeler and prototype modeler in Model Railroad News, where we mix prototype with the models a lot. But that was one of RMC's big things over like MR. Yeah.
That was the change was me. One of the things that bugged me about RMC was that the covers often did not relate at all to the content. And the prototype photographs, the reason for those was that it takes work to get a good model photo for a cover. You often have to go back to the contributor and say, well, yeah, but you got to do this and you got to do that. And Hal did not have time to do that. He had a company to run. And I was rather surprised as a kid fresh off the street. I think I was like 28 years old when I went to work there. And I figured I'd have a couple of years to, get my feet underneath me. But it was like 2 weeks or something that, here you go, kid, put out a magazine. And when I suddenly realized how much control I had over that magazine, I started looking at things that needed fixing, and the horrible Bill Shop layout drawings were just abysmal, pen and ink drawings. So I started redrawing them and then adding a scenery overlay. And one of the things I immediately started doing was saying that the covers had to relate to something that's in that issue. And then as soon as I got that under control, I started then insisting that they be model photographs. So that was the transition that happened. I can't tell you how fast it happened or anything. I'd have to go back and look at issues, but that's what that was all about.
Okay, so then how long was Jim Boyd with Karsten's then, overall?
Well, till the end, he was still associated with them, but I can't tell you what his last issue was as editor, and Steve Barry took over. Jim, there's kind of black humor here, but I told Jim that Jim was chronically late for everything, and he knew the exact minute that the printer would bounce him off the press schedule, and he'd be at the office at 4:00 in the morning, knowing that he could get to Newark and get the what we called the flats, the paste up in the pre-computer days, on an airplane and get it out to the printer in Illinois with 10 seconds to go before you lost your press date. And he just lived that way. Um, I remember going to lunch with him, and it was his turn to drive. Wayne Daniels and I and Jim. And so it's his turn to drive, and we'd go out to get in his car, and he'd have to back his car up to the dumpster and throw out all the McDonald's bags and stuff into the dumpster. Well, it was his turn to drive. Why didn't he do that before? Well, then we get in the car and go down the road, and he'd have to cash a check. Well, we'd get in line at the drive-up window in the bank to cash a check, and he'd wait till he was at the window of the bank teller, and then he'd get out his checkbook and write the check. That's just Jim. And I told him, I says, you're going to be late to your funeral. And he was. He was a week late to his funeral.
That sounds like a story right there.
Well, the poor guy he'd had a triple or quadruple bypass, and he had diabetes, and he was getting his mail from a little town, Middleville, just a few miles over the hill from where I'm sitting right now. And he was standing at the counter, and this young gal was handing him his mail, and he said, "Oh no," and he collapsed. And so they called EMTs, and it was too late. And so they looked in Jim's wallet, and the only Railfan-oriented card he had on him was the editor of Railfan by that time, Steve Berry, but it was an old business card. And it had an address that wasn't valid anymore. So there was no Railfan connection in his wallet that would let him back to the Carson's building. And all the other connections were his diving buddies, because Jim's interest had switched completely from railfanning over to diving. He had done, this is one of the most amazing things about Jim. He was kind of claustrophobic. I mean, I remember, if we get into the head of time, we spent a week in a submarine out in the North Atlantic together. And I knew Jim was a little claustrophobic, and that's why I signed him up for this cruise. And he did deep sea diving with, if you remember, this is for geezers, but the old sea hunt things where you got those round helmets with the little round face plates with the cross metal in front of them. I mean, I can't think of anything more claustrophobic than one of those diving suits with the pressure of the sea coming in on you. I mean, I'm a certified scuba diver, but man, those things just look like trouble to me. And Jim did so much diving and trying to raise interest in that kind of diving that the National Diving Manufacturers Association created a special award for people who were promoting that kind of diving, a Golden Helmet Award, and Jim Boyd was given the first one. So really cool. But he was diving with a modern Mark II, I think, helmet, which is a really nice helmet. It's very spacious, and you got two ways of getting air. You got air coming into the helmet, and you also have a mouthpiece like you do with scuba diving, giving you air. And Jim was diving, I think it was at night, and his weight belt came loose. And that's almost a death sentence if it goes off of you, because you'll shoot to the surface and can burst your lungs. So Jim, being Joe Cool, spread his legs apart to keep the weight belt from going completely off of him. And he worked the weight belt back up and secured it. But he discovered that breathing through the mouthpiece and with the air in the helmet valve open full, he couldn't breathe. But he finally managed to get back on the surface. And they took him directly to a cardiologist next to the heart specialist hospital in Morristown, New Jersey. And the cardiologist examined him and put him in a wheelchair and took him directly across the street into the cardiac unit and did a quadruple bypass right there and saved his life. So Jim almost lost his life right there. But at any rate, going back to the post office, Jim is now at a funeral home, and nobody knows how to get a hold of his relatives because the diving people didn't know him. And nobody knew how to get a hold of the family except the Railfan people. And there's no connection. But somehow the rumors started getting around, and Steve Berry, the editor of Railfan, drove over to the Middletown Post Office General Store and saw Jim's car in the parking lot. And he said, okay, the rumors are true. So then he tracked down where Jim was, and he called Mike Schaefer and Mike and Jim's sister, Barbara. And I think Mike McBride, the three of them drove out in a blizzard to, I think Jim was cremated. And all of us were down in Florida for a conference. This was in January. I think it was, I don't know what it was. I'm not sure of the year. Yeah, that sounds right. We had just gotten to Florida, and I got a call from Stephen Priest telling me the bad news. And I couldn't even turn around. I had driven down there with Judy. And even if I wanted to, there was nothing I could have done because there was a blizzard up there. And so got everything squared away and drove back to Illinois. Heroic effort on their part. So Jim was a week late to his funeral.
Wow.
So,
Holy moly.
Tony, you were thinking, or you got in the works possibly a book all about Jim Boyd's night photography.
I started pulling those pictures probably in the last 10 years. That as I'd scan things, I thought, well, this is really neat. And I do that with a lot for various things, but I started a folder of Boyd After Dark, I called it, and have kind of been working that along. And it's something that I'm looking at trying to get put together. That would be a book highlighting his nighttime photography, because
I
they
know
are
there's
such
one
striking
picture.
pictures.
There's one photo of, I guess it's would it be in the bottoms there in Kansas City? No, because there's a seaboard system. But there's one photo I remember where there's like the seaboard is above it, and then a Chessie.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
The triple crossing. Yeah, that's iconic.
And that's on the cover of, once I got into that project, I discovered there is a book, and I can't think what it's called now, but I have a copy of it. Maybe it was Old Line Graphics, or I forget who did it, but there are some Jim Boyd pictures in that book, and that's its cover, is that triple crossing of Southern Family Lines and Chessie system, and they did it at night. And it's like, hey, there is a book like that. But as I looked at it, there's a lot more Boyd stuff that Kevin U. Daly has that would make an awesome book. So, again, that's just kind of a slowly putting together project. One thing I've always wondered, and I don't know why I've never asked Mike Schaefer this, because I know Mike is a big model railroader, and TK, I know you are. Was Jim Boyd into model trains at all?
Oh, yeah. Jim was my yard master on the Allegheny Midland. Jim, if you go back in Model Railroader, he did an article on scratch building Robertson Schaefer coal dock, I believe, and also on scratch building a Hudson by laminating up a tube with, I think, like a copper tube or something with cardboard to create lagging and stuff. He was a very, very good modeler, and he became my regular yard master at Sunrise on the Allegheny Midland. He ran that with an iron fist. The Allegheny Midland, if you were up at the summit at Elda Pass, there was no place to meet a train between the summit and coming down the hill into Sunrise. So you didn't want to leave Elda Pass without getting the yardmaster's permission to do that. And I'd seen a couple of guys with their rear end of their jeans smoking who accidentally pushed on down the hill without getting Boyd's permission. I also remember one time he came in late to an operating session, and Jack Burgess of Yosemite Valley fame had just sent me a endless tape cassette that had bird sounds on it, and they cheap it away. And so I put that in a boom box and stuck it up under the mountain, and it was very realistic, and they're just chirping away and all that stuff. So I turned it on before the session began, and it was the birds were, it was beautiful. Here's this mountain and the birds are chirping and that stuff. And so Boyd came in a little late, and he came walking down the main aisle, and there was kind of an alcove off the main aisle you could stand in, and Jim was kind of standing in this alcove with kind of this pensive look on his face. And so I walked over and stood next to him, and I said, good evening. And I said, so how do you like my bird sounds? And he says, Oh, yeah, the bird sounds. I said, you heard them, correct? He says, yeah, he says, I heard him. I just wasn't sure anybody else did.
So I don't know if this is right. You maybe can help me remember this. But it seems to me I saw somewhere, and maybe even Uncle Dave, you know this too. It seems to me I saw somewhere some time ago that Jim Boyd had done something with O. Winston Link on the last night before Conrail or something. And
I was there. It was the cover of Railfan magazine, and there's a farm on the Lehigh and Hudson River Railroad just over the New York state line, and it looked like a really neat place to do the open flash kind of thing that Winston was famous for. But we had such pull with the president of the L&H that we didn't need to do it with the train in motion. We could get them to stop a freight right where we wanted to.
This is up at Baird's Farm, Tony?
Yeah, Baird's Farm.
Yep. Oh, that's a great shot. I love that spot. Awesome.
And, we'd all been up there taking that picture, but Jim and I scouted it out and decided that that'd make a really nice Railfan cover at night.
Oh, yeah.
So we got a hold of Winston. He was a crotchety guy. And we got along with him fine. And so he set up for the night shot, and I don't think I was there when they did the night shot. My memory is not clear on that. But I remember working, getting all the big bulbs set up and stuff like that. And so, as far as I know, that was the last big bulb extravaganza that Link set off. Now, Tony Cook, I just want to be sure that you understand that Jim Boyd's night photography, all of it, as far as I know, or at least most of it was done with open flash. In other words, it wasn't synchronized flash, but it was where you'd, like in a yard or something, you'd take a shot and run along the side of the train with a new bulb and take another shot and another shot, take two or three. Now, when we were on the submarine, we did have electronic flash, so that we could set up two or three of them, and once you fired one flash, it would set off the other flashes all at the same time. And I don't know whether Jim used those extensively in Railfan photography or not, but the night photography that I did with Jim, almost all the stuff we did was done, one burst at a time. Poof, run somewhere else, poof, run somewhere else, poof. It wasn't done with these great big trays of bulbs or any of this fancy stuff that like Mel Patrick and some of those guys do.
So what is Barrett's Farm, Dave?
It's a location like Tony said that has been in a bunch of Railfan photographs from the LNHR, Lehigh and Hudson River days. To us local guys in Jersey, everybody calls it the LNH, and really a beloved local railroad, one of the 7 bankrupt railroads that ended up part of Conrail, but was really decimated. Most of its main line disappeared. There's a few little remnants left, today, but almost all of it's long gone. But one of the parts that remains was reactivated by the Susquehanna Railroad, Rich Wisniewski's favorite, and Jerry Diedzich's favorite as well. They both grew up within a few miles of it down in Bergen County, northeastern New Jersey. But Baird's Farm is an iconic location with a barn and a little waterfall and a little rural grade crossing and some trees. And even today, it's a shot you see. It's a spot where if you get a daylight southbound on Susquehanna, that's a great spot to take a picture. Is the former LNHR at Baird's Farm. So I actually have a couple slides from there myself of Susquehanna trains in the 90s and 2000s.
Wow. All right. We better hear about this. You've mentioned it a few times on the other previous shows as well. This is going to be about a year-long process, I think. What is this submarine trip you speak of?
Oh, well, Flying Models ran free full-page ads for Fly Navy. public service kind of thing. And I've always been interested in submarines. So I sent a letter to the Navy Department in Washington saying that I understood that they ran dependent cruises for family members where they'd let somebody, like, somebody's brother or father or somebody, get on a submarine and sail out of New London for a day, go out and come back in a day. And they called these dependent cruises. So in return for us running all these free fly Navy ads, would they let me be somebody's honorary brother and go out on a cruise?
Fantastic.
So where did you run these Fly Navy ads? Where were they?
In Flying Models magazine.
Okay, so now we're back, and this is sometime in the 70s then.
1973.
Probably. Okay.
So I got a call from somebody in Washington, D.C., and this guy is the aide to the Chief of Naval Operations, which is spelled G-O-D. And he says, we don't run dependent cruises anymore. And I says, oh, okay, well, thanks for letting me know. He says, but, and I'm like, yeah. He said, I talked to the Chief of Naval Operations and I about had a heart attack. I mean, that's like talking to the President of the United States who has a gun, And he said that if you'd like to go out for a week or so on a short mission, he said, that would be fine. Really? And he said, yeah. He said,
wow.
He said, will you be alone? And I said, and I immediately thought of Boyd and his claustrophobia. So I said, well, no, I'd like to take a photographer, because my proposal was that I'd like to do a book about submarines. I still would, And so he says, would you like a diesel or a nuke? And I said, oh, a diesel. Yeah, for sure. And he says, okay. He says, report to New London on May 3rd or something, 1973. And you'll be all set. Be there at, 0800 hours or something and all that. So at any rate, I says, terrific. So I walked down the hall at Carson's. And Jim Boyd, we had new Selectric typewriters, IBM Selectrics. And if you ever typed with one of those things, if you tried to type a little too fast, they'd take off on you. You go tink, 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 And so I could hear Boyd in there going, because he was used to an old hand bomb Royal that he carried around in the trunk of his car. So he was hammering on this thing, and bang, 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 you'd take off on him, and crap, bang, 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 crap. So I stuck my head in his office and I said, keep the first week in May open. You're going to be out in the North Atlantic in a submarine. Okay. So then I walked back to my office. About 10 seconds later, I hear feet coming down the hall. I'm going to be wearing a what? And so we got there and we got all the briefings about how to use the toilet and all this stuff. And so we get in there, and one of the first lectures we get is that you can do anything you want to do in a submarine, go anywhere, but you can't go in the radio room. And I says, because of codes. And they said, that's correct. And you can't go in after torpedo room. Why? Can't tell you. Okay. So the first thing I did was I went to the after torpedo room, but I didn't go in it. I just stuck my head in there, and here's this rating back there. And I says, understand, we can't go back there. He says, that's right. I said, okay, no problem. I says, where's the radiation monitor gauge? He says, up there in the bulkhead. And then he got this hurt look on his face. So why is there a radiation monitor gauge on a diesel submarine? So that evening at dinner, at evening mess, I asked the captain, I said, okay, so I've established that you have a radiation monitor gauge in the after torpedo room. Why do you have the nuclear warhead torpedoes in the after torpedo room? He said, well, he says, which way would you want to be going if you fired one of those things? So I said, at what, 8 knots? He says, well, every little bit helps. I said, so you think you got much of a chance against the Soviet submarine in this diesel boat? He says, well, he said, frankly, those things are really noisy. He said, they're their machinery is really, really noisy. And he said, we're really, really quiet. He said, so if we can detect him first, he said, we can get a shot off, but he said, God help us if we miss. Jim and I were sleeping in bunks that somebody who was not on the trip, the cruise that we were on, was vacating. And we were told that how the toilet worked, it was you'd go in this small room, and there was this, looked like a regular toilet, but it kind of had a big lever beside it, a big Johnson bar, and it was full of water. And the guy said, you do whatever you got to do in the toilet, and then you shove this Johnson bar to the rear, and it rotates the cylinder and opens up a slot, and whatever you did goes in the slot, and then you rotate it back, and then you turn a green handle, and green handle means seawater, and seawater comes in there and refills the water in the John, and when it's refilled right level, then turn it off again. Okay. Said, but don't do it if they're blowing the sanitary tank. Well, how do we know when they're blowing the sanitary tank? He said, well, there'll be a notice on the bulletin board. Okay. So when we get in there, and the first time we're in there going to John, turns out there's 2 green handles. And then we get worried about the fact that there's several bulletin boards, and we're not really sure which bulletin board we're supposed to be reading. And we're wondering if the guy who normally posts a notice about blowing the sanitary tank is the guy whose bunk we're in. So the whole thing gets a little bit nervous about it. But we managed to get going there, although Boyd was convinced it's the second green handle on the John jettisoned the conning tower. So he was touching everything kind of easy. We were sleeping in the bunks, and we were both having a nice rest. We got very green the first day. It was very rough. And we sensed it over the evening meal and went up in the bridge to try to get some air, but it was too late. So we both hit the bunks and had 16 hours of just absolute ugh. If somebody had a 45 caliber pistol, we'd have shot ourselves. But then we got our sea legs and we were fine. Nothing bothered us at all. But I woke up one time and felt the ship vibrating. And Jim was snoring away on the bunk above me. And I then heard very, very faintly way down the main passageway about they were firing water slugs simulating torpedo firings. They just flood the torpedo tube with water and fire it. So you'd hear fire one, and the whole ship would shake, and then one fired electrically. And so the second time they fired one of those things, Boyd's snoring stopped. And it was just dead quiet in his bunk above. And then it kind of resumed a little bit. The third time they fired one of those, Jim woke up with a real start, and the bunks were solid steel on all sides, all 4 sides, except and above and below you, except that there was half of one side was open so you get in and out. So Jim raised up real quickly, and his head hit the steel above him, just as a blank, And I saw these 2 legs come down over my opening in my bunk. And I said, relax. He said, what's going on? I said, they're just firing practice torpedoes. He said, oh my God. He says, I thought I slept through a bending ship.
So was Jim married?
No. Jim made the comment that he would never have anybody who would have him on those grounds alone. And it's kind of amazing because some friends of mine that I thought were just totally unreachable by the female half of the population were totally happily married. So there truly is somebody for everybody. But Jim just was too much set in his ways, and he just couldn't settle down to accommodate anybody else's schedule or priorities or anything else. I don't think he suffered much for it because he kept really, really busy. I mean, he traveled, he went to movies, he went out to dinner all the time. He just he had a pretty full life. I don't think he sat around moping at all. I think he did just fine.
So, do you have a favorite Jim Boyd photograph?
No, I really don't. That's an interesting idea to contemplate. I'll have to think about that, but I don't really have one.
All right, we'll come back to you, Tony. With all the slides that you've scanned of Jim Boyd's, does one stick out in your mind or one or two stick out in your mind as beyond spectacular?
There's some, the one that I think of a lot. I think it's a horseshoe curve, and it's right about the time of Penn Central, like 68, 69. And there's pictures of Mike Schaefer there, and then shots of the trains. And it seems like there's a couple of good shots of, like, maybe SD-45s or big Centuries. They're passing each other with like auto racks full of late 60s cars and such. And I think those are would have been a neat trip. When I see all those pictures especially because Mike Schaefer's about the same age as my assistant editor, Shane Mason, is now. And I think that we go out, rail fanning and do these kind of road trips and such. And it's like, was kind of the same situation Jim Boyd had with Mike Schaefer, that they both, age wise and all that, I think was about like that. So but that Pennsylvania trip is one, when I see those pictures, that's neat stuff.
Dave, do you have any particular Jim Boyd shot that sticks out to you, or?
It's all of what we're talking about. It's, again, for me, Jim Boyd was one of just another legendary photographer that had a bunch of books to his credit, that had seemingly been everywhere and done everything when it comes to taking train pictures. So as a kid, and again, he really used available light with his night shots. Maybe it was some headlights or whatever, but it was not a super fantasy approach. I mean, he really liked railroading for what it was and took simple pictures that were perfectly composed over time. And one of the favorite ones that growing up, I had a couple of his books, and a lot of it was outside my frame of reference because it was old enough that me, as sort of the next generation, most of this stuff is stuff that had disappeared before I was really conscious of what was going on. But there was one photograph, and I'm paraphrasing, but I actually had a T-shirt of it that I got at a train show, probably illegally made. But it's a picture on the Rio Grande, just downhill at Tunnel 1, I believe, on the Front Range. It's a westbound train coming up the hill. And it's an SD-40, it's probably 2 or 3 SD-45s and a GP-40 and a GP-30, the usual Rio Grande, lash up of different EMDs coming up the hill with a short and fast manifest. And it's a good shot, but the caption will always be in my mind. And it's one where Jim Boyd wrote that they were looking for a train in the Rio Grande. He was in town for Denver on business, i.e., I'm sure delivering engines to somebody else. And just, took the rented car, drove up the Front Range, and they just ran into a train at the right time. But he had to, you park the car on the Coal Creek Canyon Road. You have to run, 200 yards up a slope to get to the tracks. And of course, he flew out from New Jersey or whatever. So, running uphill at 8,000 or 9,000 feet elevation is a different story. And he says that he spun around, the camera was cocked, he composed it, shot it, didn't focus, didn't adjust the exposure, just got lucky. And then I think that the last sentence of his caption says, sometimes being lucky is good enough. and it's this great Rio Grande picture that in my mind is, defining one. And sure enough, like as a kid, that one will always stick out to me because, here's this guy that ran up a slope and turned around and nailed this awesome shot of a railroad that when I was 12 or 13, I didn't think I'd ever be able to see it because SP was buying it, and that was going to be the end of the Rio Grande. And sure enough, here's this Jim Boyd shot with that caption. I said, wow, what an opportunity.
We always set our cameras back in the Ektachrome X days. We always had the lens set at 500s at 5.6. And so you got lucky more often than not because that was usually the right exposure.
So it was 500 IS. What is it, ISP?
500 would be the shutter speed.
Oh, okay, all right.
And 5.6 would be the f-stop. Yep.
Okay, right, all right. Okay, wow. And why Ektachrome X as opposed to Kodachrome? Just because of the graininess?
Well, Kodachrome X came out about that time, and it was a very contrasty film, and we didn't like it at all. Kodachrome had been a very good film up to that point, but it was slower. And then they screwed around. I mean, you didn't want to use Kodachrome 25 because it was too slow. And they came out with this Kodachrome X, and it was awful.
So what's the basic difference between now we're talking film, which really, has anybody been using film for the last 20 years? Probably not.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's Otto von Druck shoots film.
Really?
And I've got a buddy over in St. Louis that, in fact, at the recent St. Louis RPM brought me KCS slides that it's like, and I'm trying to, because you look at a slide immediately, you're thinking, well, this is at least 20 years old. And no, these are slides that this is last month. And so, yeah, they're still,
That's really surprising. Not that he's using film, but that you have a buddy.
Oh, thank you.
If you ever do man, I'm telling you, Jim Boyd Night Photography, what a book that would be. That would be spectacular. But the only thing I would think is getting the captions done would be fairly time consuming, because you couldn't have a book like that without captions, because, people would want to know exactly what's going on and where it's taken and any information that you might have. Tony, is there any way you can find this information out, or is it just kind of you write a caption that's suitable for the photo?
There's a lot of guys, as I scan slides, some of them are meticulous with, this is at milepost whatever, it's eastbound, it's westbound, here's every number in the consist, and it was 98 cars. And then you have Jim Boyd slides. And
and Tony Koester slides same way.
There's nothing on him. In fact, Mike Schaefer's told me beware of the processing, looking at the slide mount to see June 67 Kodachrome or something, that again, a lot of them are dupes and other things. So if I even try to go by that sometimes for info, it's like, be careful. Wait a minute, think about that. When did they get those? It's like, that's probably older than that's a copy. So that has been one challenge with all the Boyd slides. Although it's great to have Mike Schaefer I will usually send out an email saying, do you recognize where this is? Or we've got a whole group of these, or those delivering locomotive shots, that Georgia Jeep 40 recently, there was somebody walking out of one of the cabs, and I sent Mike Schaefer the picture, and I said, I know that's not Jim Boyd, but is that somebody, or who is that? And a lot of times, Mike will. In fact, I remember sending a picture to you, TK, I think it was of the Berkshire, and it was Boyd, you, maybe Mike Schaefer, and somebody else. And it was just a slide I'd scan, and I recognized everybody but whoever the other person. And I think it was Dean or whatever, whoever that one guy was.
Richard Dean.
Yes, they said that's who it was, because I didn't know who that was. And I never knew about Boyd's. This has been very enlightening on the submarine and the diving stuff, because, there's the one Illinois Central book, and I think the about the author or in the introduction, there's a shot of Boyd sitting there, and he has one of those big, helmets with the little face round trapdoor thing on it. And I always wondered, what's the connection between that and Illinois Central? Why has he got a diver's helmet for his IC book picture? And now it's oh, that was another hobby of his. I didn't know that.
Well, it was beyond another hobby. I mean, his life completely switched after he left Railfan, and it became almost totally everything that he did was the diving.
Really? So he just kind of lost interest in the rail fanning altogether, pretty much?
It seems so. I mean, his buddies, everybody he seemed to deal with was the diving group.
Really? Huh. And just so everybody knows, because we've mentioned his name several times, exactly who is Mike Schaefer? Tony?
Oh, he is the editor of Passenger Train Journal. He's as TK said, he lives up in Northern Illinois. He was with Kallenbach for many years. He's been with White River. contractor basis with like the Passenger Train Journal. He does a number of the Historical Society publications, the layout and editing of those. And Mike's a big time passenger train fan. He's done an Amtrak or two book over the years, but very well known rail fan guy.
Dave, just so we know where we stand as the future goes along. If you ever go into deep sea diving, you're pretty much on your own, buddy.
That's what it sounds like. Holy moly!
I've never heard that right turn, but I know and I don't know if Dave Ingalls did, but like Dick Wallen, I remember really got into airline stuff in the 1970s, and we'd go to have slideshows there with like Dave Ingalls, Dick Wallen, and that, and then suddenly they start showing jumbo jet pictures. And Dick started collecting all that kind of airline stuff, just like he did railroad stuff. And it always seemed so odd, but I've heard or seen that from other guys that are rail fans, but then also get into, planes as well. So,
well, David P. Morgan launched that Airliners International magazine at Cornwall. But the problem was they couldn't break through advertising because the logical advertisers like United and Holiday Inn and places like that, the ad agencies wouldn't place the ads because the circulation wasn't big enough for them to make enough commission. They wouldn't bother.
All right. Do we have one last Jim Boyd story that you want to share, TK, before we close this one out?
Yeah, there's probably my favorite Jim Boyd story. We were down in Virginia chasing George Hart's Pacifics. They were double-headed on the C&O's Greenbrier branch. And we'd scouted out the branch the day before and found places that we wanted to get photographs. And there was this one spot where there was a gravel parking area that was raised high above a curve. So if we got back in time to get to this parking area, we could look down on this curve as it curved away from us. Beautiful shot. And if we got there a little early, you could actually cross over maybe to get on the inside of the curve and shoot up. But I didn't think that was going to happen. But Jim was considering it. Well, of course, we didn't think about all the civilians that were going to be at this same parking lot the same day. So Jim had a Super Pinto, which was a Ford Maverick, a bright yellow thing. And so here comes the Pacifics are headed down the branch towards the C&O main line. And we come in there about 100 miles an hour and slid to a stop, which, raised a huge cloud of dust that endeared us with all the locals. And the New Jersey license plate, of course, cemented our relationship with them even further. And so we jumped out of the car, tripods and cameras in hand, and we ran to the edge of the parking area. And between us and the tracks was this very deep ditch, a real swampy looking thing with weeds and cattails and all that stuff, and just looked like Snake City, just no way in the world was I going down there. But Jim decided that the shot was on the other side of the tracks. So there was this guy sitting there leaning up against his pickup truck. So I'm standing beside this guy in his pickup truck. Jim dashes down and goes down this hill, and he's holding his, like a rifleman in Vietnam going through a rice paddy. Jim's got his tripod on both hands above his head. And he's up to almost his chest in this swampy crap as he's going down through this stuff. And I turned to this local guy and I said, "Are there any snakes down in there?" And the guy looks at me and he looks at Jim and he doesn't say a word. I thought, well, we deserve to be, kind of brushed off. So Jim keeps going down through this weeds and all this crap. And then finally he emerges and he climbs up on the right of way and he gets up on the tracks. And the guy turns to me and says, "Nope." It's almost a Shaggy Dog story.
Yeah.
And that's dedication. I mean, yeah, I don't know if it was Kraus Maffei's coming out of the Moffat Tunnel. I'm not going to go through a swamp of snakes to get a picture.
Tony, back in the day, though, we were in our 20s. You take some risks every once in a while. I think of some of the stuff that I did when I was younger, and holy moly, I got lucky a couple times.
Yeah,
But that's one of the things I think Jim Boyd did for our community of not just model railroaders, but rail fans and rail historians is that, he really, there's lots of EMD reps, but he's the one that really photographed almost a generation of new power, a new generation on the railroad, and did it with the zeal of a lot of people, his senior, that would have done it for steam engines. And so for kids like me, kids like me, what we have now are these fabulous color slide renditions in these big books, showing us weathering patterns. It's all natural environment railroading. So it's a modeler's dream. There's a lot of great 1960s and early 70s scenes that are there for us to peruse. It's great.
Do you think, TK, do you think that was overlooked? I know in talking before he passed away, I remember meeting with Dave Ingalls and Dick Wallen talking about pictures and documenting that stuff. And they both said it, and my dad has said it, that the first generation of diesels really got overlooked by so many guys because they were focusing on the end of steam. Same as when you look at kind of that explosion of all the bigger freight cars in the late 60s into the 70s, it's like, why weren't people taking more pictures of those things? Well, everybody was chasing down the last run of this or that passenger train, going up to Amtrak. So it seems like some of those get missed, but Jim Boyd was one of those people I feel like was there and shooting the stuff that maybe, he shot a lot of steam too, going through the slides and things. Any of the special like steam excursion stuff, there'll be tons of slides. But the run-of-the-mill GP35 or SD40, I feel like he documented that a lot, where some of those I feel like as, guys were chasing steam in the last of passenger trains, that we missed a lot of opportunities for some great stuff in the 60s that should have had more slide shot of them.
Yeah, I don't think Jim missed very much. He was not prejudiced against anything that I can recall.
Wow, fascinating. There's got to be, again, that just shows you how big this hobby is. And there's got to be all kind. I think it'd be fun to do a podcast just about railfan photography and do's and don'ts of railfan photography, or rail fanning and photography, or anything like that.
And it's changed so much. That's so different, even in the last 20 years. Yeah.
Yep. Now, then, even that's something that's true. It's there's a lot of forbidden places now that there weren't before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of, it has changed so much. Guys like Jim Boyd just did a huge favor to the world for this particular hobby by out there. So, Tony, you must have, how many slides do you think you've taken, Tony K? How many slides do you think you've taken in your lifetime? You must have, you must have just a ton of stuff yourself.
Oh, Lord. I can turn around and I just see stacks and stacks and stacks of yellow Kodak boxes.
Maybe you should send them over to Tony Cook and he can scan them for you.
I scan them as I need them.
I got 2 scanners. If I could just train my dog to put the slides in and out of that scanner.
It does take a lot of time to scan a slide.
Oh, I always have it sitting right here next to me as I'm working on magazine stuff. And it's like when it gets quiet, it's like, oh, I haven't heard the scanner buzzing lately. Let me flip slides here. So,
Yep.
Yeah, there is no real easy way to scan slides, is there?
No. The fastest way are these autoloader trays where the special setups where you can scan the whole carousel or scan a whole box with a stack loader, but it's not set up for the high resolution scans. And even if it were, you really do have to calibrate some of these things. It's certainly not automated. And because there's not that many more slides in the world, it's hard to imagine the scanner's getting better than what we've already got.
That's true too. Yeah, it's something that's going away. Absolutely,
it really is. I think that's why I have 2 of those Nikon cool scans, because I tried several other things and never got that same level of quality.
No, I got it. Yep, that's it.
Yeah,
the Cool Scan 5. That's it.
And Nikon doesn't make it anymore. In fact, and you have to use like ViewScan software. I think I finally did get into the code to get, was it Windows 10 or something, locked out the Nikon software to do the scanning, but I did get that fixed. But so yeah, it's almost kind of a dead technology in a way that, well, who needs a slide scanner? And it's like, well, a lot of us do, but not enough of us do.
True. Yeah, well said. That's a good call.
Have you scanned? So what do you use, TK? What do you use? Have you given any thought to getting your slides scanned?
I scan them as I need them, and I use an Epson 700. Steve Berry recommended it, but again, like Tony said, you get locked out of. You get a new computer and it won't work, but fortunately, there's this company called ViewScan that makes things work, and I got my scanner working again with that, and I'm real happy with the Epson 700. It does just fine.
All right, cool. All right, well, on the next edition of the 47-part Tony Koester Trilogy, I think what we're going to do next is have some of the AML crew come into the studio and just have at it. Just blast away and ask you questions. What do you think of that?
That'll work.
Yeah, well, wait till you meet some of them. There's a guy named The Spoon. Give that boy a wide berth. Interesting guy, a lot of questions, but give him a wide berth when he starts.
That's honest.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, there you go. Yeah. All right. Tony, could you give out our email address?
If you would like to send an email to us at A Modeler's Life, you can do so by going to the website, amodellerslife.com. And when you get there, you'll see the angry or slightly agitated Bruce the Mail Boy. It's a blue square you can click on, and that'll open your browser and send an email. Or you can type in modellerslife@gmail.com and send an email as well. And that's modelers with one L.
Dave, I always think of, whenever I hear Tony do something like that, I'm always thinking he's like this silky smooth sounds.
He does it well. Yeah, better than me. That's for damn sure.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Way better than you. I
know, that's why I said it.
I can't believe you were with the transportation. What is he called? The transportation secretary.
Yeah, the guy from the president of the the cabinet of the president of the United States. His right-hand guy for transportation was sitting in my office desk today for an hour. Just another day in the life.
Right.
So, but you can't make this stuff up.
But seriously, would it have killed you to slip him an AML button or something?
Yeah, I don't think so. Just like Jim Boyd found out if there was a snake in the grass by walking through it.
That would have been nice. See Pete with a AML button on there on his lapel.
He did have a nice NJ Transit mask, and we gave him an NJ Transit infrastructure engineering T-shirt. So we'll see if he shows up in any of those pictures later.
And what was he doing? Riding the train? That was the whole bit?
Yeah, they were going to ride the train between Somerville and Westfield, look at some of the transit-oriented development that's going on, and talk to politicians about this, supporting this big infrastructure bill.
How big was the entourage? How many people all involved were there?
There's probably about 50 people at the station for this, including the media, and about 20 of them got on the train to go east together. They had one of the cars was chartered off for the entourage. So yeah, it was. The company came together, and a lot of us didn't know about it till Friday afternoon. So it was a lot of weekend work to get it set up. And I'm very grateful to my employees that dropped their plans and come to the table ready to help. It really, that's how the railroad's always worked, and I'm proud to be part of it.
That's for sure. All right, and we have a website, modellerslife.com. If you go there, and you'll see all sorts of stuff. You'll see all the upcoming episodes, all the past episodes, and there's an opportunity there. You can click on a tab called Patreon. And if you think this is fun and you want to listen to twice as many podcasts, you can click on the Patreon tab, and it'll take you to where you can, for just 365 easy payments of 16 cents a day, you can get twice as much podcasting.
What if I wanted a Modeler's Life t-shirt? Is there a way to get those?
Yes. If you want a Modeler's Life t-shirt, all you have to do is go to Midwest Model Railroad. That is our media. That is the hobby shop that is affiliated with a Modeler's Life. And if you go to their website, which is midwestmodelrr.com, and go across the navigation bar and click on AML, you will be taken to a wonderland of AML hats, hoodies, T-shirts, mugs, one of which I'm sure Tony has one of each. TK has one of each. So is he still here, or did he leave?
Yes.
All right, so that's it. So, Tony, do you remember what you have to do, or would you like a reminder?
Oh, I love reminders.
Okay, so at the appropriate moment, at the absolute appropriate moment, you have to say, "Happy Rails to you." So it's like, it's not hard to do. You just have to wait for the absolute appropriate moment and then just go with a lot of enthusiasm. That's the key. That's what sells it, is the enthusiasm. Like, as if you're happy to be here. You know, like you're pretending that you're happy to be here. I mean, it's acting, really.
I can fake it.
Okay. What did you think, Dave?
Are you kidding? What a blast. Great day. Yep.
Well, Tony, as we close the barn doors, another episode of A Modeler's Life, and the sun slowly sets over the back 40, I guess there's nothing else left to do except for you to say,
Happy Rails to you.
Mr. Strang's wardrobe provided by The Dashing Camper. For all your fashion and tent repair needs, trust The Dashing Camper.
It's another Lincoln Homer.
oh, I forgot to hit the record button.
Oh, well.
All right, take two.